Have you ever found yourself reflecting on a moment in your life and wondering how you missed all the warning signs? That was me, caught up in what I thought was my perfect suburban existence. I had a gorgeous wife named Claire, a woman I envisioned growing old with, and our daughter, Emma, my pride and joy. Life was supposed to be straightforward. Work my 9 to 5, come home to my family, and cherish the little moments. But here's the kicker about those so-called little moments. Sometimes they serve merely as distractions from what's truly happening beneath the surface. Looking back now, it's painfully clear how blind I really was. It all kicked off around 8 months ago. Claire began to act strangely. At first, I can't quite articulate it. It was just an unsettling gut feeling that something wasn't right. She started working late more frequently, taking these unexpected business trips that seemed to materialize out of thin air, and whenever I asked about her day, she wouldn't even make eye contact. The excuses were always the same. "It's just work, Michael. I'm doing this for us," she would say, dismissing my concerns like I was simply being paranoid. And like a naive fool, I took her words at face value. I wanted desperately to trust her. As the weeks morphed into months, the chasm between us only widened. The state of our bedroom? Don't even get me started. Our once active sex life dwindled from a few times a week to maybe once every 2 months, if I was fortunate. And when we did manage to connect, it felt hollow, as if she were merely going through the motions, almost irritated that she had to. I remember one evening trying to initiate intimacy, and she just rolled over, muttering, "Not tonight, I'm tired." It's curious how she was tired so often, yet somehow never too fatigued to dress up, apply perfume, and work late. It wasn't just me who picked up on the shift. Emma noticed it too. At 13, we had always shared a close bond, but she began to cling to me more. I could see it in her eyes. She sensed something was off, but being a child, she lacked the tools to process it. Her relationship with Claire had never been stellar. My wife could be harsh, constantly critiquing Emma's grades, dictating her wardrobe choices, and trying to control her social circle. "You're not going out in that," Claire would bark whenever Emma attempted to wear something a little trendy. It wasn't discipline. It felt more like Claire was relentlessly searching for flaws in her own child, nitpicking every little thing. Then one Friday afternoon, everything changed. Emma came home early from school. A teacher had a family emergency, and they canceled classes. I was still at work, so she let herself in as usual. But this day felt different. That evening, she looked pale, as if she had seen a ghost. At first, I thought she might be unwell, but she kept giving me this terrified look, as if she was scared to say what was on her mind. Finally, after dinner, when Claire left the room, Emma broke down in tears and spilled it all. "Dad, I saw Mom with Mr. Stevens," she whispered, trembling. At first, I was baffled. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What about Mr. Stevens?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "I saw them kissing," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "In his classroom. They were really close, and they didn't even notice me passing by." I remember just sitting there, feeling as if I'd been punched in the gut. Mr. Stevens. Just hearing his name made me sick. He was Emma's history teacher, this mid-40s, wannabe intellectual with his tweed jackets and that smug little smirk. The type of guy who probably thinks he's superior to everyone else just because he enjoys reading poetry and spouting philosophy like he's in a Victorian novel. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to believe that Emma had made a mistake. Maybe she misinterpreted what she saw, or perhaps it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. Why would she fabricate something like this? As much as I wished it weren't true, all those late nights and Claire's business trips began to fall into place. I sat there in stunned silence, struggling to grasp the reality of what my own daughter had just revealed. "Are you certain?" I asked, grasping for any shred of doubt. "Are you absolutely sure that's what you witnessed?" "I'm sure, Dad," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I wish I weren't." Just then, Claire walked back into the room, beaming as if nothing was amiss, and I couldn't bear to look at her. I felt nauseous, like the world was spinning out of control. I mumbled something about needing to go to the garage and practically bolted from the room. There I was sitting in my damn garage, staring at my toolbox, trying to process it all. Part of me wanted to march back inside, grab her by the shoulders, and demand the truth. But I held back. Not yet. I needed solid proof before confronting her. The days that followed were pure hell. I began scrutinizing every little thing Claire did. How she would leave the room to take phone calls. How she would lock her phone like it was a vault. And the texts, always typing away, but whenever I asked who she was chatting with, she'd get defensive, almost furious. Jesus, Michael, can't I have any privacy? She snapped one night when I inquired about a late-night text. Stop being so goddamn paranoid. Paranoid. That's the term she kept throwing at me. But I wasn't paranoid. I was finally starting to see things for what they were. And it wasn't merely about the phone calls and texts. There were other signs too, like how she'd buy new clothes but never wore them around me, or how she suddenly became fixated on her appearance, but only when she was going to work. And every time I tried to discuss our relationship, every time I attempted to ask why we never talked or had sex anymore, she'd twist it around, shifting the blame onto me. Maybe if you weren't so needy, we'd have a better relationship, she said once, her tone chilling and dismissive, as if I were some pathetic, clingy loser for simply wanting to connect with my own wife. But the hardest part was watching Emma. After that day, she distanced herself from her mom, and every time she looked at Claire, it was as if she couldn't bear to be in the same room with her. I could see how much it pained her, knowing what her mom was up to, whatever it was, and that shattered me inside. I wanted to shield Emma from all this mess, but how could I protect her when I didn't even have the full picture myself? I realized I had to take action. I couldn't just sit back and let this destroy my family. Yet, I couldn't let Claire know I was onto her, either. If I confronted her without concrete proof, she'd deny everything, twist my words, and paint me as the villain, leaving me to apologize for things I hadn't even done. No, I needed a strategy. I had to catch her in the act. That's when I decided to reach out to my buddy, Jason, the maintenance guy at Emma's school. If anyone could help me uncover the truth, it was him. And that's how the real game began. So, there I was parked in my truck outside the school like some wannabe private investigator, my mind racing between anger and despair. I couldn't stop replaying Emma's words, couldn't shake the image of that snake, Mr. Stevens, with his hands all over my wife. And Claire? Every time she smiled, every laugh that used to bring me joy, now all I felt was rage. It was as if she were orchestrating some twisted performance, with everyone in on the joke except me. Tom was not on my side. I needed proof, and I needed it fast, but I was at a loss for how to start. That's when I dialed Jason's number. Now, Jason isn't your typical guy. Sure, he's a bit rough around the edges, but he's fiercely loyal. We've been friends since high school, played on the same football team, and shared more wild nights and foolish escapades than I could possibly remember. And he just so happened to be the head of maintenance at Emma's school, with keys to every door and access to every room. If anyone could help me get the evidence I needed, it was Jason. Hey man, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I spoke into the phone. I need a favor. And before you ask, yeah, it's serious. Shit, Michael, what's going on? You sound like you're about to lose it, he replied, concern cutting through his usual relaxed demeanor. I spilled it all. I told him about Emma catching Claire with Mr. Stevens, about my growing suspicions, and how home felt like a battleground with the enemy sitting across the dinner table. Jason didn't pry too much. He just listened. When I finished, there was a pause, an uncomfortably long one. I half expected him to call me crazy or tell me to handle my own problems. But instead, he said, "All right, man. I've got your back. Let's catch these bastards." That's how the plan took shape. We decided Jason would install a hidden camera in Mr. Stevens' office. The guy was a creature of habit, always hanging around his classroom after hours, claiming to be working. And Claire, with her endless work excuses, seemed to have the freedom to do as she pleased. So I suspected that whatever was happening between them was likely occurring there. Jason assured me he'd position the camera behind a stack of books on Stevens' shelf. Somewhere it would be completely hidden. While Jason worked on setting up the camera, I was left to navigate the chaos at home. You'd think that after hearing what Emma had told me, I would be able to mask my emotions around Claire, but every word out of her mouth ignited my fury. It felt like she was taunting me, relishing in the fact that I was onto her. She'd come home later and later, tossing out half-hearted excuses like, Oh, traffic was a nightmare. Or, I had a last-minute meeting. Sometimes she'd come in reeking of perfume that definitely wasn't hers. The kind you wear when you dress up, not the stuff you throw on for a day at the office. And whenever I confronted her, she either shut down or lashed out, ripping into me for being overbearing. "Why are you so obsessed with where I am all the time?" she snapped one night, slamming the bedroom door behind her. "God, Michael, it's like living with a jealous teenager. I'm busting my ass to provide for this family, and all you do is nag me like I'm doing something wrong. You sure you're working for the family?" I shot back, unable to hold back my anger. "Or are you working on someone else?" The instant the words left my mouth, I regretted them, but the damage was done. Claire's eyes widened in shock before narrowing into those hateful slits I knew all too well. "What the hell does that mean?" she spat, venom dripping from her voice. "Are you accusing me of something, Michael? Do you really think I'd cheat on you? You've lost your mind. This is exactly why our marriage is crumbling, because you're so insecure, so paranoid." I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. She twisted everything, making me feel like a crazed husband imagining things that weren't there. And she was skilled at playing her cards just right, storming off in a huff, slamming doors, leaving me there to stew in my doubt. Meanwhile, Emma retreated to her room, earbuds in, trying to drown out the shouting. I could see the disgust and sadness mixing in her eyes as she looked at her mom. My little girl, caught in the crossfire of a mess she never asked to be part of. Even though the tension was unbearable, I had to keep my cool. I had to maintain the facade of the clueless husband. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until I could check in with Jason. Finally, a few days later, he called. "Got it set up, man," Jason said over the phone. "Just give me a couple of days and I'll have that footage for you. You'd better be ready for whatever you find." And so began the waiting game. Those days felt like the longest of my life. I was a bundle of nerves, holding myself together with little more than tape and glue. It seemed like Claire was teasing me at every turn. Each morning, she'd kiss me goodbye, wishing me to have a great day. But I could sense the emptiness behind those words, as if she were merely playing a role she had long since abandoned. And every time her phone buzzed, she would flash that sly smile, the same one that used to make me feel cherished, but now it only ignited my urge to smash her phone against the wall. I attempted to spark some small talk, hoping to coax her into opening up. "So, how's work treating you? You seem really busy lately," I'd say, trying to sound casual while fishing for any hint of what was going on. "Fine, Michael," she replied tersely, barely lifting her gaze from her phone. "Same as always. Why do you keep asking? Jesus, you can be so boring sometimes." Boring. That's how I had become to her, I guess. Just the husband who no longer measured up. The way she looked at me, like I was merely an inconvenience, made me wonder how long she'd been harboring those feelings. Had she ever genuinely loved me? Or was it all just an elaborate act from the very beginning? Meanwhile, Emma did her best to remain unseen. She would come home, head straight to her room, and only emerge when she needed to eat or grab her backpack for school. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for her, aiming to be the dad she could rely on, but the expression on her face told me she understood that things would never return to what they once were. Finally, after days of pretending, of holding my breath every time Claire walked out the door, Jason called me back. "You need to come over," he said, his voice grave. "I've got the footage." I can't recall much about the drive to Jason's place, only that my hands were shaking so violently I could hardly keep a grip on the wheel. When I arrived, he didn't utter a word, simply handed me the laptop and hit play. And there it was, Claire, my wife of 15 years, perched on Mr. Stevens's desk, her legs wrapped around him as they kissed like teenagers unable to keep their hands to themselves. And then, as if that wasn't enough to shatter my heart, they slipped into the supply closet together. I sat there, frozen, staring at the screen as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. But it was all too real. Every second of it was undeniable, and I couldn't pretend I wasn't witnessing the truth. I was at a loss for what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm into that school, confront them both, tear Mr. Stevens apart with my bare hands, and scream at Claire until she felt just a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted on me. But I held back. I knew that if I acted impulsively now, I would lose my temper, lose the upper hand, and perhaps even lose my daughter in the chaos. No, I had to be strategic. I needed a plan. I had to bring them both down in a way that they'd never see coming. That's when it hit me. This wasn't merely about gathering proof. This was about revenge. The days that followed seeing that footage were among the darkest of my life. There I was attempting to navigate my daily routine, taking Emma to school, going to work, forcing a smile when Claire walked through the door, all while knowing that my entire existence had been built on a lie. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from the video replayed in my mind. Claire's hands tangled in Mr. Stevens's hair, their lips locked like they were insatiable for each other, disappearing into that damned closet. It took every ounce of strength not to explode, not to confront her and force her to confess what she'd done. But I knew the timing wasn't right. Not yet. But revenge? That became the one thing fueling me. The thought of striking back, of hitting harder than they could ever imagine, that's what motivated me to get out of bed each morning. For that, I needed allies. I couldn't take this on alone, and I wasn't about to let Claire trample all over me while pretending to be the perfect housewife to the world. No, this was war, and I had to find the one person who had just as much at stake as I did. Nicole Stevens. Nicole, a woman I'd only seen a handful of times at PTA meetings and school events, always wearing a tired smile, trying to maintain a facade alongside her obnoxious husband. I knew she had kids, too, in fact, both younger than Emma, and she was one of those involved moms, constantly volunteering and chatting with other parents. But I had never really considered her much before. Now, she was the key to helping me dismantle the whole charade. At first, I was unsure how to approach her. How do you break the news to a woman you barely know that her husband is sleeping with your wife? But I was left with no choice. I needed her on my side, and I had to bring the truth to light. So, I decided to tackle it like ripping off a Band-Aid, quick and straightforward. I found her email through the school's parent directory and sent her a brief, direct message. Hi, Nicole. It's Michael Johnson, Emma's dad. I think we need to talk. It's about your husband and my wife. Can you meet me at the Coffee Bean on Elm Street this Friday? I know this sounds crazy, but it's important. The next few days were torture. Every time Claire smiled at me or inquired about my day, I had to fight the urge to retch. I was polite, for Emma's sake, but being around her was unbearable. Even sitting at the same dinner table felt like a performance, as if I were an actor in a play I hadn't auditioned for. And she played her role flawlessly. Loving mother, dedicated wife. If you didn't know any better, you'd think we were the perfect family. Finally, Friday arrived, and I concocted some excuse about needing to work late. I told Claire to pick Emma up from school and that I'd grab dinner on my way home. She didn't bat an eyelash, too preoccupied with her phone to care about where I was headed. Typical. I arrived at the coffee shop early and settled into a corner table. I couldn't sit still. My foot tapped incessantly against the floor. When Nicole walked in, I recognized her immediately. Tall, with dark hair tied back in a neat ponytail, dressed casually in a sweater and jeans. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days, and there was a look in her eyes, a look that suggested she already knew something was amiss. She spotted me and approached, her complexion pale. "Michael?" she asked, her voice small yet steady. "Yeah, thanks for coming," I replied, trying to keep my voice composed. I gestured for her to take a seat, and she did, nervously clutching her purse. "So, what's this about?" she asked, glancing around as if expecting someone to leap out and shout, "Surprise!" I couldn't fault her for being on edge. Who wouldn't be after receiving a message like mine? "I'll just get straight to the point," I said, leaning forward. "I believe your husband, Mr. Stevens, is having an affair with my wife, Claire." Her expression went blank for a moment, as if she couldn't process what I had just said. Then it crumbled, her lips quivering. I don't know what to say. "Are you certain? I mean, do you have proof?" I didn't respond verbally. I simply opened my laptop, clicked on the file, and turned it around so she could see the video. I watched her go pale as it played, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes glued to the screen. There was no denying it. It was all right there. And when the video ended, she sat there, staring blankly at the table. I suspected for a long time, she finally whispered, tears welling in her eyes but not falling. But I never had proof. I thought maybe it was all in my head, that he was just tired from work or something. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment we sat in silence. Two people who had been deceived, lives shattered by two individuals we thought we knew. In that moment, an unspoken understanding formed between us, a bond woven from anger, betrayal, and a shared thirst for revenge. He's done this before, you know, Nicole said finally, her voice firmer now. Your wife isn't the first. I've caught glimpses, text messages from other women, but he always found a way to explain them away. And I let him. God, I was so naive. You're not naive, I reassured her, trying to provide some comfort. I mean, look at me, I've been kept in the dark for who knows how long. But now we have the truth. And I think we need to do something about it. She looked up at me, wiping away a tear, her expression hardening. Yeah, you're right. We can't let them get away with this. And that's how it all began. We sat there for hours, discussing everything. Our marriages, the lies we'd been fed, the people we thought we had married. We exchanged stories of pain and resentment. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of camaraderie. I wasn't just some fool being played. Nicole wasn't merely a pitiful wife clinging to a cheating husband. We were allies, united by our intent to make them pay. So, what's the plan? She asked, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I saw the same determination mirrored in her face. A fierce resolve that matched my own, a mutual need to set things right. I don't know yet, I admitted. But whatever it is, we're going to ensure they regret every second of what they've done. We brainstormed ideas, exposing them to the school board, sending the video to the parents, or even posting it online to publicly shame them. Our ideas were bold and reckless, fueled by our collective anger. There was a thrill in it, an adrenaline rush that reignited a sense of purpose within me, something beyond being the oblivious husband. Eventually, we agreed to meet again to finalize our plan. Nicole offered to host, suggesting her house would provide more privacy and be less likely to arouse suspicion. As I walked back to my truck that night, I felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. I knew there was no turning back, no unseeing what I had witnessed, no undoing what I was about to do. But I also recognized that for the first time, I was taking action for myself, for Emma, fighting back against the life that Claire had taken from me. As for Claire, she had no idea what was coming her way, and neither did Mr. Stevens. After that meeting with Nicole, I felt like I was floating in a haze, balancing on a tightrope between fury and desperation. But one thing was painfully clear. I was not going to let Claire and Mr. Stevens slip away unscathed. We were going to expose them, ruin their lives just as they had done to ours. With Nicole as my unexpected ally, I actually felt like I stood a chance. She was sharp, strategic, and driven by the same vengeful fire that burned within me. Over the next week, we stayed in close contact, texting back and forth, brainstorming ideas like we were planning a heist. I had to tread carefully. Claire was always nosy, constantly probing into who I was talking to when I was on my phone. "Who are you chatting with?" she would ask, narrowing her eyes in suspicion as if I were the one hiding something. I had to lie through my teeth, fabricating excuses and telling her I was discussing a work project with Jason. She would huff, roll her eyes, and retreat back into her world, the one she had crafted where I was the fool and she was in control. Little did she know, her world was about to come crashing down. Nicole and I agreed to meet at her house on a Thursday evening. She mentioned she had sent her kids to stay with her parents for a few days, claiming she needed some space to figure things out. Stevens, being the piece of work that he was, didn't even seem to care. He probably thought he was getting a free pass to keep seeing Claire without his wife around to ask questions. Just thinking about it made me want to puke, but it only fueled my resolve to see this plan through. That evening, I concocted another excuse for Claire, something about staying late to help Jason with a project at work. She barely lifted her gaze from her phone as I spoke. "Whatever, Michael. Just don't wake me when you get back," she replied, her tone icy and detached. It stung, but I swallowed that hurt down. She'd regret treating me like this soon enough. When I arrived at Nicole's house, I was taken aback. I had expected one of those picture-perfect suburban homes, but instead, it looked like a tornado had hit. Dishes were piled high in the sink. Laundry was strewn across the couch. Clear signs of a woman too consumed by her own heartache to bother with tidiness. Seeing the chaos gave me an odd sense of solidarity. I wasn't the only one facing a crumbling life. Nicole welcomed me inside, poured me a glass of wine, and we settled at her kitchen table, a palpable tension hanging in the air before the conversation truly began. "So, have you thought about how far you want to take this?" Nicole asked, swirling the wine in her glass. The anger simmering beneath her calm demeanor was evident. "I want them destroyed," I stated without hesitation. "I want to obliterate their lives just as they've obliterated ours. But we must be strategic about it. They need to feel the weight of their actions, both of them." She nodded, her expression firming up with determination. "I agree. I've been considering we could send the video to the school board anonymously. Once they see it, Stevens won't have a leg to stand on. He'll lose his job and his reputation. As for Claire, perhaps we should send it to her workplace too? Let her coworkers see what kind of business trips she's really been on." A smile broke through my somber mood for the first time in weeks. "Nicole, I love your thinking." We exchanged ideas rapidly, brainstorming all the possible ways to make them pay. By the time I finished my second glass of wine, we had compiled a detailed action plan. Emailing the video to the school board, distributing it to every parent at Emma's school, and posting it anonymously on social media. Each idea felt like a precise jab at the two people who had shattered our lives. The more we discussed, the more animated we became, as if we were strategizing for an all-out war. But as the night wore on, our focus began to shift. The adrenaline from plotting our revenge, the fury, the heartache, it all swirled together, mingling with the wine, evolving into something entirely different. I can't pinpoint the moment we crossed the line, but at some point, the dynamic in the room changed. It became less about revenge and more about the two of us, broken and hurt, finding comfort in one another's presence. Nicole got up to fetch another bottle of wine, and I noticed how close she lingered next to me, closer than necessary. When she turned to meet my gaze, there was something in her expression that was new, an understanding, a shared pain, and maybe just a flicker of desire. Then, in an instant, I stood up, and before we could second-guess ourselves, our lips met. This wasn't a simple peck. It was a kiss laden with anger, desperation, and a deep-seated need. A kiss that conveyed, "We're in this together." We didn't need words. One kiss led to another, and soon we found ourselves tumbling into the living room, our clothes becoming an afterthought. It wasn't romantic or soft. It was raw and instinctual, like two people grasping for any sense of control. We crashed onto the couch, hands exploring, mouths colliding everywhere. For the first time in months, I felt a surge of vitality. I wasn't the pitiful husband left in the dark anymore. I felt empowered, in command. It was reckless, perhaps even misguided, but in that moment it felt completely right. When it was over, we lay there, catching our breath, gazing up at the ceiling. I half expected to feel guilt wash over me, to regret what had just happened, but instead, I felt liberated, like I had reclaimed a part of myself that Claire had stolen. "Wow," Nicole whispered, finally breaking the silence. "I didn't see that coming." "Neither did I confessed, running my hand through my hair. "But I don't regret it." "Me neither," she replied, her fierce determination still shining through. "And this, it doesn't change anything. They still deserve everything that's coming to them." I nodded in agreement, and we both sat up, hastily putting our clothes back on, trying to restore some composure. By the time I left, it was almost midnight, and as I drove home, I was flooded with mixed emotions. What I had done was complex, but somehow it felt like a pivotal moment. I was no longer just a victim. I was a man ready to fight back, reclaiming my life step by step. When I returned home, the house was shrouded in darkness. Claire was either asleep or pretending to be. I slipped into bed beside her, and the scent of her perfume assaulted me, the same fragrance she wore the night Emma caught her with Stevens. Yet this time, I didn't feel nauseous. I didn't want to cry or scream. I felt prepared. Prepared to set our plan in motion. Prepared to watch Claire's world come crashing down. I knew Nicole felt the same way. We were in this together, and there was no going back now. The following morning, waking up next to Claire felt like waking up next to a stranger. She lay there peacefully, as if completely unbothered by the storm brewing around her. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to remember the woman I once loved, the partner who promised to stand by my side for life. But all I could see was a deceiver, a manipulator, and a woman whose world was on the brink of collapse. And it was about time. The plan with Nicole was both simple and ruthless. We decided to begin with the school. After all, the affair had blossomed within its walls, tarnishing the very institution where our children went to learn. Nicole and I spent hours drafting emails, creating fake accounts to send them from so they wouldn't trace back to us. Each email was marked with a subject line: urgent, ethical violation by a school teacher. Attached was the video, those damning minutes of passion between Claire and Mr. Stevens. Watching it on repeat felt like plunging a dagger into my heart, but I knew it was necessary. As we clicked send on the final email, a wave of anticipation washed over me, a heady mix of nerves and adrenaline. It felt like waiting for a bomb to detonate, knowing that the explosion would alter everything in its wake. The fallout was instantaneous. By lunchtime, Nicole's phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from other parents. Some were shocked, others livid, but all were disgusted by what they had seen. By the end of the school day, Mr. Stevens' reputation lay in tatters. He didn't even show up for his last class. He had been summoned to a meeting with the school board, his career hanging by a thread. I couldn't help but picture the look on his face as they confronted him. The panic, the dread of a man who thought he'd escape unscathed. That evening, Claire walked through the door, dutifully playing the role of the perfect wife. But I could sense her unease. She kept checking her phone, her fingers shaking as she typed. It didn't take long for her to unravel. By the time I finished dinner, she entered the living room, phone in hand, her complexion pale as a ghost. "Michael," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk." I kept my eyes glued to the TV. "About what?" I asked, feigning ignorance about the storm brewing. "There's something that happened at school today," she stammered. "Mr. Stevens, there's a video circulating, and people are saying, they're saying terrible things. But it's not true, Michael. You have to believe me. It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like." I interjected, my tone frosty. I stood up, towering over her as the weight of her deception loomed between us like a brick wall. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sleeping with our daughter's history teacher in a damn classroom, Claire." Her expression crumpled, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I shouted, losing my grip on my composure. "That you're a liar? A cheat? That you've been throwing away our marriage for some loser who can't keep it in his pants around the very kids he's supposed to teach." "I didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed, collapsing onto the couch. I felt so lonely, Michael. It seemed like you didn't love me anymore, and I made a mistake. But it didn't mean anything, I swear. Didn't mean anything?" I echoed, the words leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. "You shattered our family, Claire. You broke Emma's trust. You broke my trust, and you expect me to believe it didn't mean a thing? It meant everything, and now you're going to pay for it." I stormed out of the room, leaving her in a whirlwind of tears and excuses. I couldn't bear to listen anymore. I headed to Emma's room, and there she was, my little girl, sitting on her bed with her sketchbook in her lap, pretending not to have heard the chaos. But I could see the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal and confusion. I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me, burying her face in my chest. "I'm so sorry, Emma," I whispered, holding her close. "I'm so sorry you have to go through this." "I just wanted to stop," she replied, her voice muffled against my shirt. "I just want everything to go back to the way it was." I wished I could grant her that wish. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back. The only way forward meant getting Claire out of our lives for good. The following day, Nicole and I set phase 2 of our plan in motion. She distributed the video to the parents at the school, while I reached out to my lawyer, David, to begin drafting the divorce papers. David was straightforward, no nonsense, and he reassured me that with Claire's infidelity, I'd have a solid case for full custody of Emma. With Claire's reputation in shambles, it would be difficult for her to argue otherwise. As the legal proceedings began, the scandal at school escalated. Mr. Stevens was formally fired, his teaching license revoked, and he quickly became the subject of gossip all over town. Whispers about him were everywhere, and both he and Claire became social pariahs in our community. Claire attempted to go to work, but the judgmental stares, the hushed whispers, and the knowing looks became unbearable. Eventually, she quit, claiming she needed space to think. But I knew the real reason. She was running from her own shame. In the meantime, Nicole and I grew closer. We met regularly to discuss the divorce process, our children, and our lives after the storm we had unleashed. Being around her felt comforting, like two shipwreck survivors navigating the tumultuous waters of our new realities. We developed a routine, talking late into the night, sharing our fears and dreams, and slowly, the raw anger and pain began to fade, replaced by something gentler, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Then came the court hearings. Claire attempted to put on a show of remorse, claiming she was willing to do anything to mend her relationship with Emma. But it was all just a facade. Even Emma saw through it, refusing to speak to her mother during the proceedings or to be in the same room with her. When the final verdict was delivered, granting me full custody, Claire crumbled, pleading with me for another chance, to let her back into our lives. But I was resolute. I had seen her true nature, and there was no turning back from that. The day the divorce was finalized felt like shedding a heavy weight I had been carrying for far too long. I was free. Emma and I were free. We packed our belongings and moved into a new home, a smaller place across town that felt like a fresh start, a sanctuary devoid of Claire's haunting lies. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated my energy to Emma. We explored new hobbies together, hiking, attending our classes, and enjoying board game nights every Friday. I watched her slowly come back to life. Her laughter returned, and the spark in her eyes began to brighten. She picked up drawing once more, filling her sketchbooks with doodles and dreams, channeling her emotions through her art. Then I met Rachel. She was a single mom I encountered at one of Emma's art classes. Our conversation started with our kids, then naturally progressed to our lives, and it quickly became evident we shared common ground. She had endured her own rough divorce and carried her own scars. We exchanged stories over coffee while the kids painted and laughed. There was no pressure, no rush, just two people figuring out how to rebuild their lives. For the first time in a long while, I felt happy, whole, like I was finally living life on my own terms. Claire still reaches out occasionally, leaving voicemails and sending texts, expressing her desire to see Emma and make amends. But Emma isn't ready, and I'm not sure if she ever will be. Honestly, I can't blame her. Some wounds time doesn't heal, and perhaps that's okay. Looking back now, I understand that this experience wasn't merely an ending. It was a new beginning. It marked the start of a life where I finally learned to stand up for myself, to fight for my happiness, and to protect those I love. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't pretty, but I wouldn't change a thing. Not for anything. Because at the end of the day, Claire and Mr. Stevens didn't come out on top. They lost everything. And me? I found something greater. I discovered myself and unearthed the strength to start anew. And that's the sweetest revenge of all.